Okay. Okay, so first of all I'd like to outline what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll begin with an introduction where I'll give you a couple of personal experiences to do with community singing, not in the 1920s, but something that's more contemporary and quite similar. The next 3 points I'll run through quite quickly because I think many of you probably know something about this already. I know there's one person who's actually written something about this, looking at the origins and foundations, the development of the movement, repertoire, the type of songs that were sung in community singing, and popularity. For me, the more interesting areas are the last points, what were the actual motives behind the community singing movement on a national basis, and we'll be talking about the Daily Express, who are the main kind of sponsors of the movement, and also locally looking at different kind of locations around the country and why they got involved in this movement that was initially national. And then the most important element for me is the effect on spectator culture. Did the community singing movement have an effect on how spectators behaved in sports stadiums, and if so, what actually might that effect have been? And then finally, rather than conclusions, I'm going to look at some areas for further investigation, because this is a kind of something which I'm in the process of doing. I don't have enough data yet to make any definite kind of conclusions about this, but we will look at that at the end. So, the personal experience was from the Champions League final in 2008, which, if you remember, was between two British clubs, Chelsea and Man United. What some of you may not remember was that this was in Moscow. And I had this experience of travelling to Moscow, which is a very long and arduous process, and for a lot of people they went some crazy routes around Europe. It took them hours and hours and hours to get there. And also because of the time difference in Russia, the game didn't kick off until 11:15 at night. So if you imagine we get into the stadium and the crowd is absolutely exhausted. People have really had enough of the travelling and the difficulties finding their way around Moscow with the Cyrillic alphabet, etc. And the atmosphere was dead, okay? Which is not what you expect for a Champions League final. The next thing, James Richardson of Football Italia fame gets onto the pitch with a microphone, and first of all he goes to the Chelsea fans, it's about time we started singing. He had a song ready, Blue is the colour, and he actually directed the first few lines and eventually gets the Chelsea fans singing, and by the end of the song there's a massive noise, very impressive sight from the Manchester United end. Then he turns around to the Man United fans and he says, okay, let's sing Glory, Glory, Man United. He joins in with the first couple of lines, same process. And I have to say, at first I thought, how naff. As somebody who, watched football in the 1980s and, the real kind of terrorist culture, etc., etc., I thought it was really naff, but it worked. And from that point, the atmosphere was absolutely fantastic. It got the adrenaline running, it got people singing, losing their inhibitions, and really had an effect. Now, the reason I mention this today is because there is a kind of similarity there to the whole community singing movement. The idea of community singing, certainly in a kind of sports context, is that you orchestrate the fans to sing a selection of songs that you've chosen beforehand. And what the Daily Express would do, the main sponsors of the event, is actually give out song sheets on the way into the ground, or they'd be in the programme for the match. And there'd be a band and a conductor, and they would actually orchestrate the singing. Now, in terms of my PhD, which is looking at the kind of relationships between song and sport, I'm particularly interested in this kind of folky element of fans actually singing spontaneously, working kind of popular songs, etc. And this idea that there's a real kind of spontaneity to this act. And I'd be looking at, for example, sporting broadside ballads in the early modern period, looking at music hall songs with a sporting context, and also obviously terrorist singing and terrorist culture. And the interesting thing for me is, where does community singing fit into this kind of overall narrative that I'm trying to create about sporting song? Now, at this point, I should mention the good work that's been done already about community singing. For example, Geoffrey Hill wrote a fascinating article as part of the Sporting Sounds publication. And that was focused particularly on Abide With Me, the concept of remembrance, and how the FA Cup becomes this very important national institution. It's not exactly what I'm going to be looking at, but it's interesting anyway. Dave Russell, in his article Abiding Memories, looks at the kind of wider social context of community singing, possible legacies that it may have left. And there's also an interesting article in the Soccer History magazine, which is a shorter kind of summary of community singing. It's basically a call for more research into some kind of regional location, etc. So the origins and foundations, if you don't know much about community singing, then one interesting question is, how new was it? Was it something really that was different from things that had happened before? And Dave Russell, for example, said that you can trace the roots of community singing in psalmody festivals of the mid-19th century, musical singing where the actual audience of the musical would actually all stand up and sing together some of the popular songs. Obviously World War I troops were well known for singing while they were marching, etc., etc. YMCA festivals were organised in the early 20th century where they encouraged this kind of group singing activity. Even 200 years before, there was a letter to the Musical Times of June the 1st, 1927, this is at the height of the kind of community singing movement, where the writer of the letter relates a description from September 1559 of psalm singing. And the idea that, and I'm quoting, as soon as they commenced singing in London, immediately not only the churches in the neighbourhood, but even the towns far distant, began to vie with each other in the practice. You may now sometimes see at St Paul's Cross, after the service, 6,000 persons, young and old, singing together. And in a rather kind of snotty post-comment to this description, the writer of the original letter says that, is the singing of Abide With Me at a football match, against a background of catcalls, rattles, bells, etc., in order to advertise a daily paper, an improvement on this raising of a sturdy psalm tuned by 6,000 believers in an open space in Old London. Now, the kind of snottiness that's evident towards community singing is something I'll discuss a little more later. But the idea is that it wasn't necessarily something that was revolutionary and was completely new. The community singing movement, as far as it relates to sport, started in the first instance of that was Boxing Day 1926, but before that, a community singers association had been set up that organised events. For example, they had events in the Albert Hall, a big hall in Birmingham, and also events in workplaces and this kind of thing. And the idea of the Community Singers Association was to set Britain singing, and this was the slogan that they had. And Gibson Young was one of the main conductors of community singing events. And in an interview with the Daily Express a few years later, he actually claims the whole community singing idea as his own. And it was based on his experiences of travelling around Australia and New Zealand, where they already had community singing events. And something that he brought back to Britain, he had an interview with Lord Beaverbrook of the Daily Express, and he said that very, very quickly Lord Beaverbrook cottoned onto the commercial potential of this particular thing. And from that point, it was promoted very, very heavily by the Daily Express, and there were lots of other newspapers involved in community singing, but by far and away the Daily Express were the most important kind of promoter of this movement. And what the Daily Express managed to do, they managed to give the community singing movement this kind of aura of respectability by some of the kind of musical characters that they had involved. And they created a movement in the sense that this was something that started with concerts in the Albert Hall, etc., and then moved to football, and very, very quickly, within a year or so, it spread like wildfire up and down the country. Not just in England, also in Scotland and Wales, in lots and lots of different contexts. And as you can see from the kind of Daily Express title there, a national movement, this is what they were trying to create. This is the article with Gibson Young, and I'd just like to point out that he reckons that he conducted 12 million people, just to give you some idea of the extent of the movement. Whether that's an exaggeration or not, we don't know. I mean, he wasn't involved in the sporting side of it so much. He actually talks about in this article how when they first, were moving to the first football event, he actually got sick, and he was replaced by T.P. Ratcliffe, who became the kind of iconic conductor of football community singing. Now, looking at the development of the community singing movement, and as I said, they moved to football grounds on Boxing Day 1926. This was a game between Fulham and Reading, and it soon became a national craze, and football grounds up and down the country were involved. The high point of the community singing movement was the FA Cup final of 1927, and the Daily Express pulled off something of a coup by being allowed to sponsor this event, produce a song sheet with the programme for the cup final, and particularly that they actually, the presence of the monarchy there, and they actually, Daily Express were able to create a myth that the King had actually chosen "Abide with Me" as one of the songs that would be sung as part of the programme. Whether that was actually true, or the extent of whether that was true, is discussed in the Geoffrey Hill article, and also Dave Russell discusses it more briefly. It's not so important. The idea was that the Daily Express had created this movement that the King was actually involved in himself, and there are photographs of the King actually singing along to the songs as part of community singing. It was also adopted by other national newspapers, organisations and football clubs. Even the Daily Express, they actually talk about their own rivals, their competitors, organising their community singing events. So although this was a commercially driven movement, there was this idea that they were actually happy that other people were taking up the same event. There's one article in the Daily Express, for example, they're talking about Yorkshire, where they list 7 different newspapers just in Yorkshire that are actually involved in community singing football events through this 1926-27 season. Now, generally, certainly from the point of view of the Daily Express, the enthusiasm starts to wane sometime in the following season, so in the season 27 to 28. And eventually community singing is just limited to the big cup matches, internationals, that kind of thing. I say generally from the point of view of the Daily Express that there are kind of sporadic examples right through the 1930s of people actually requesting community singing in particular areas. For example, I've got a letter to a newspaper from the West Midlands from 1937 where somebody says, well, wasn't the community singing last year in the game between Aston Villa and Newcastle really good? Can't we have it again this year? So there are examples of how community singing on this basis lasted longer, but generally there's a kind of real reduction in the intensity of the reporting of community singing and the number of events that are happening. For example, in the Daily Express in the 1926-27 season, community singing is front page news, literally. And there are a number of examples of big spreads on the front page about community singing. By the next season, it tends to be on page 9 or page 10, a small column in the Daily Express. So they kind of moved on to different things, let's say. And that's an example of one of the front page spreads. This is T.P. Ratcliffe that I mentioned before, the iconic figure in the white flannels, etc. And this is reporting on the cup final. The King amazed by community singing. The King talks about the beauty of the singing and the emotion, etc. During the singing of "Abide with Me," particularly. Looking at the repertoire, and I've taken these ideas from Dave Russell, that he actually divides the repertoire of community singing songs into different kind of areas. And one thing that you can say was that the repertoire was highly distinctive. And the songs were chosen because of the limited technical demands they would make on the singers. Obviously, if you've got groups of untrained singers, you can't have something that's musically very complex. And there's quite a tight body of well-known material, 20 or 30 pieces that were sung with any regularity. And Dave Russell splits these into folk or national songs, depending on how you choose to describe them. So, for example, All Through the Night or Loch Lomond. World War I musical songs, the only real musical songs that were chosen were ones that were sung by the troops in the First World War. So it's a long way to Tipperary, Pack Up Your Troubles, were 2 very, very popular songs. And then obviously hymns and carols, the most famous of which being Abide with Me. Now, one important thing there that you may notice is that none of these songs were actually contemporary popular songs of the time. And the contemporary popular songs of the time, very, very American influence, jazz influence, this kind of thing, were studiously ignored by the community singing movement. And when we come to look at the motives behind community singing, one idea is this kind of cultural regression, that in a sense we don't like the way that our culture is developing, and through community singing we're going back to something that was popular in the past and trying to kind of reignite the popularity of these old kind of folk songs, etc. So looking at the popularity of community singing, it does seem genuinely popular, although this is something that is in a sense top down, that it's been organised by elements of the national press and it's very, very orchestrated. There seems to be no reason to believe that the people themselves involved in the community singing didn't enjoy it. From the photographs that exist and the recordings that exist, the reports in the local press particularly, people did seem to actually get caught up in this kind of national craze. And in a sense, it captured the popular imagination. In the same way the Express's enthusiasm waned, it also seems that popular enthusiasm wanes at the same time. And I mentioned the exception with the letter to the Western Times about the Aston Villa situation before. There are always exceptions to this. In terms of negativity, there are examples of negativity towards community singing, and the letter that I told you about the psalm singing in the 16th century, I think is an example of that. Another example of you've got a letter to the Times, 29th of April 1929. Massed bands, raucous appeals from a dozen or more loudspeakers pointing here, there and everywhere. Even the gymnastics of the community singing conductor himself failed to extract from the crowd a few ghostly echoes. That is, until the band started to play with Abide With Me. And it's actually Abide With Me, and you know, the Geoffrey Hill article talks a lot about this. This is the thing that's stuck, and in a sense one of the legacies of community singing is the importance of Abide With Me and its importance to the whole kind of institution of the FA Cup final and how important this is. Now, looking at the motives of community singing, and just thinking about the articles that I mentioned at the beginning, there's a little bit of a difference in focus according to who's writing. So Dave Russell, for example, says that there can be no doubt that the Express's motives were almost exclusively commercial. So, you know, any other motives that were involved, and for sure there were some, were very, very minor, as compared with the idea that the Daily Express were looking to sell more newspapers, and this was a time of a great kind of circulation war in British newspapers. The article in Soccer History focuses more on the kind of the idea of promoting social cohesion at a time when Britain was a divided nation. There's no coincidence that 1926 was the year of the general strike and the extended miners' strike. And there's a lot of talk within the Daily Express and the rest of the press about how community singing can actually unite the country and heal these kind of social divisions. There also seems to be an element of anti-modernism and nostalgia, and this idea of returning to a merry England that somehow has been lost in the interwar period. Just to give you a flavour of some of these kind of motives, just read you some selected examples from the Daily Express. So Great Britain was once the most musical of countries when it won for itself the title of Merry England. And the idea is that by creating this community singing movement, we go back to this idea. Community singing is the natural and spontaneous expression of the emotions of a crowd. An English or a Scottish crowd is shy of singing in public. So there is this idea that somehow we've developed in our kind of national character this shyness of being able to sing in public. I will mention this later when I look at the research that I did into pre-war crowd singing, that I'm not sure that that was actually true. All classes will join in one song. So this idea of the class divisions that existed, that somehow through community singing we could bring these people together. British troops sang their way to victory in France and in the Great War. Okay, so this kind of looking back to the war, this kind of great moment in British history, and somehow through community singing we can kind of create this. We shall see a brighter nation emerging from the gloom that has enshrouded post-war England. So the sense there that the kind of hangover from the First World War has created a country that is less sure of itself, less confident, it's become more reserved, it's less merry, and through community singing we can get back what we had before, basically. We shall we shall have a mighty antidote for all the petty spites, jealousies, and misunderstandings that arise from the political and industrial situations of the day. So there you have an almost direct reference to the kind of industrial strife, the political strife that was happening politically at the time. Also, obviously, there's the idea of remembrance, and as I say, I won't go into that too much because it's been discussed already, but certainly this is in terms of the singing of Abide With Me, and you can see from the picture there, you know, this idea of people taking off their hats. Yeah, okay. Okay, looking at more local motives, looking at the kind of regional press, it's clear that they saw the commercial benefit of community singing, that through doing community singing events they would get more people through the turnstiles, they would make more money. It's quite plain to see that. They also have a nostalgia for the old songs, and there are a number of letters that were written into the local press saying, you know, isn't it great that we can sing the old songs again, not this new kind of American rubbish that's on the market now. Also the idea of the joy of singing in itself, nothing political, no kind of deep sociological reasons for this, that, you know, it's just really, really good fun to sing in large groups of people. To liven up the atmosphere in a stadium. Also this idea that requires active involvement rather than the passive involvement of the kind of mass culture that had come in the interwar period, gramophones, the cinema, etc. And people also, responding to the national movement, people who'd actually been to the FA Cup final and saying, why can't we do this in our local community? I'm going to go through that because of time. Okay, so the effect on spectator culture. What I've looked at before and what I presented at a Splash Symposium back in June was the situation before the First World War. And what I found was, from looking at lots of different reports, was that there was a vibrant spectator culture with crowds singing at all levels of football and rugby in stadia, travelling to matches and at victory parades. And there's every reason to believe this continued in the early 20s. There are isolated examples to show that this culture continued in spite of community singing, so that nothing really changed despite this movement. There's also evidence to suggest that the advent of community singing, however, coincided with the decline in the spontaneous singing which existed pre-war. Now, these are examples of how things continued as usual. I'm going to run through this quite quickly, but one thing that I found with pre-war was that particularly the Welsh fans in a rugby context, that they would be very, very songful, particularly singing the Welsh national songs, etc. And this is a report from 1929 saying exactly the same thing. A report to the Derby Daily Telegraph from 1935, and this is a case of some men involved in a political disturbance, and they were singing songs, etc. And their defence lawyer says it was just what occurred at football matches throughout the country each week. So this is saying that in the mid-1930s the situation was essentially the same. Then we've got a description also from 1935 of an England-Scotland match at Hampden Park, and a Dundee journalist talking about Dundee fans, saying as the trains drew up, bands of youths leant from the carriage window singing popular songs. Exactly the same kind of thing as you would get pre-war. In the same report, however, earlier on, and it's a very, very long report discussing, what the fans were doing, what kind of they had for dinner, lots and lots of detail. He actually says that if not a city of sunshine and song, Glasgow was today a place of sunshine and bustle. So the idea is that the streets weren't filled with fans singing songs. Also, in an article in Soccer History magazine, we've got something about why West Ham fans sing "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles." And there's a comment about Swansea fans singing the same thing, that between 1920 and 26, Swans fans used to sing Bubbles at their home games, and this is mentioned in a history of Swansea Town published in 1982. Something stops in 1926. This is why I was asking about the pier diving before, that, why is it, does this happen up until 1926 and doesn't appear to happen afterwards? Also talking about the Yee, one of the first football chants, one of the cartoonists of the 1950s is reminiscing about the situation in football earlier on. And he talks about after Bill Haynes' departure, he was one of Southampton's famous players. In 1932, the muses and inspirational football appears to have deserted Southampton until the late 1940s. And by the muses, he means this idea of the kind of musicality of the fans and the singing of songs, because this is what he's talking about just before he gives you this quote. Also in 1930, you've got Alex Jackson, who was a Chelsea footballer he was Scottish and he'd grown up playing football in Scotland. And there's an article with his reminiscences about the football of his youth. He was born in 1905, and he talks about schoolboy football for his local village of Renton, etc., and youth football. And he talks a lot about people coming and singing. So he said there'd be hundreds of his friends and his compatriots coming to watch their games, singing songs, etc., etc. And he goes on to say that partisanship was such as London probably never dreamt of, and the kind of the atmosphere of the article is that these were the good old days, that something clearly has changed in modern football culture. Okay, as I said at the beginning, this is something that I'm in the process of looking at, and I need more data basically to draw any more firm conclusions that there is some kind of change between the pre-war period and the late 1920s. And there are a couple of problems with just comparing the kind of newspaper reports from the two different periods. The first one was perhaps crowd singing was not as reported as it had become commonplace. If you remember the lawyer's comment that this just happens up and down the country at every single ground, it wasn't worth actually writing articles about, whereas pre-war, perhaps they thought, wow, this is something new, this is something special, and that could be a reason for the difference. It could be that community singing didn't really affect the actual singing of songs, but it actually affected the reporting of singing of songs. That if a journalist was going to write about fans singing, he'd be much more likely to write about it in the context of community singing, which is part of this great national movement, rather than actually just mention the fans, that, you know, the idea that fans were singing in itself. An interesting idea is that if there was a decline in spontaneous crowd singing, and I certainly get this impression just through researching the two periods, that it's a lot easier to find examples pre-war than it is afterwards. That this is part of wider cultural and social changes, and this idea, this transformation to a mass culture, a more passive culture. Dave Russell, for example, talks about how pre-First World War, this kind of combination of popular music and sport isn't forced, it's something that's very natural. And he then goes on to say that probably this is just true for the pre-First World War period, but he also doesn't have enough evidence to say that for sure. But it seems to me that something does change, and I'd like to look at more evidence to see, you know, whether I can actually corroborate that with more examples, such as the ones I've given you today. Okay.